There is a particular kind of conversation that leaves you feeling like you've lost your mind. You confronted someone about something they did. Something clear, something documented, something witnessed, and within 60 seconds, you are somehow the one apologizing. You walked in with a grievance, and you left carrying their guilt. You're not sure what happened. You replay it. You check your memory. Everything still points the same direction it did before. And yet something has shifted in the room, in the relationship, in your own sense of what's real. This happens too often to be accidental. And it follows a pattern so consistent, so reliably reproducible, that researchers have given it a name. What we're dealing with is not a communication failure. It's not a misunderstanding or an unfortunate personality clash. It is a defensive architecture, something built into a particular kind of mind that converts accountability into persecution so quickly and so completely that the person doing it may not even realize it's happening. That's the part that's genuinely unsettling. The transformation is often sincere. To understand why narcissists play the victim, you have to understand what a narcissist is actually defending against. Not what they appear to be defending, not their dignity or their reputation, but what is actually threatened when someone criticizes them. Psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, writing in the 1970s, drew a distinction that has held up remarkably well. He described the narcissistic personality not as someone who loves themselves too much, but as someone whose sense of self is fundamentally unstable, fragile, dependent on constant external confirmation, and catastrophically vulnerable to anything that interrupts that confirmation. Kohut called the pain of that interruption a narcissistic injury. It is experienced not as embarrassment or disappointment, but as annihilation. The self doesn't just feel criticized, it feels erased. This matters because of what it means for accountability. When a psychologically stable person is told they've done something wrong, they can hold the criticism at a slight remove. They can assess it. They can feel defensive and still, eventually, integrate some version of it. The self survives contact with the accusation. For a narcissist, that contact is existential. The accusation doesn't arrive as information. It arrives as an attack on the only structure holding them together. And when you are under existential attack, the question of whether the attack is justified becomes completely irrelevant. You don't stop to evaluate the argument. You eliminate the threat. Playing the victim is, at its core, a threat elimination strategy. If you can become the injured party, and do it fast enough with enough conviction, then the original grievance disappears. It doesn't get refuted. It gets overwritten. In 1997, psychologist Jennifer Freyd documented a behavioral pattern she called DARVO. Deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. She developed it originally in the context of institutional abuse responses, but it maps with uncomfortable precision onto narcissistic interpersonal dynamics. First, deny the behavior, then attack the person who raised it, their motives, their character, their credibility, then reverse the roles entirely, positioning the accused as the real victim and the person who came forward as the real perpetrator. It is a sequence, not a reaction. It has structure. What Freyd found, and what subsequent research has confirmed, is that this pattern is particularly effective precisely because it's so disorienting. The person on the receiving end of DARVO reports confusion, self-doubt, and a strong compulsion to reassure the person who just harmed them. The reversal works because humans have a deep aversion to being seen as cruel. If someone in front of you is visibly distressed, visibly convinced that you are the aggressor, something in you wants to fix that. You want to prove you're not a monster, and in doing so, you abandon the original complaint. Baumeister spent years researching what he called the ego threat hypothesis. The idea that it is not low self-esteem, but threatened high self-esteem that produces the most aggressive, defensive responses. People with grandiose but unstable self-images react to criticism with disproportionate hostility, not because they secretly feel worthless, but because the gap between how they see themselves and what is being implied is simply too large to tolerate. His 1996 paper with Smart and Bowden connected this directly to violence, anger, and interpersonal aggression. The dangerous person is not the one who feels bad about themselves. It's the one who needs to feel exceptional and suddenly doesn't. The victim role solves this problem with elegant efficiency. It doesn't require the narcissist to lower their self-image. It requires them to raise their threat level. If you are not a person who made a mistake, you are a person who is being persecuted, then your self-concept remains intact. You are still special. You are just tragically misunderstood. There is also something deeper here, something structural in the way narcissistic personalities construct their own story. Psychologist McAdams has spent a career studying narrative identity. The idea that we understand ourselves through the stories we tell about our lives. What he found in narcissistic populations is a consistent narrative pattern. The protagonist is either heroic or victimized, with very little space for anything else. There is no ordinary human muddle in these stories. There is triumph, or there is betrayal. This isn't strategic storytelling. It reflects something real about how the narcissistic mind actually experiences events. When a relationship ends, it wasn't a complex incompatibility. It was a betrayal. When a business fails, it wasn't miscalculation. It was sabotage. When someone criticizes them, it's not feedback. It's an attack. The victimhood isn't performed from nothing. It is generated by a cognitive architecture that genuinely cannot process events any other way. Otto Kernberg, whose clinical work with severe personality disorders remains foundational, described this as a failure of what he called object constancy, the ability to hold a complex, ambivalent view of another person. The narcissist splits. People are either all good or all bad, idealized or devalued. And when someone, particularly someone close, does something that triggers the devaluation switch, the emotional experience is of being betrayed by an enemy, not disappointed by a flawed person. The shift from hero worship to victimhood narrative happens fast, and it is not consciously constructed. It is the mind doing what it was built to do. This is the part that confuses people who have been close to narcissists. They ask, how can someone believe this? How can they sit in front of you with all the evidence pointing one direction and be genuinely convinced they're the one who was wrong? The answer is that they often can. The victimhood isn't always a lie. It's a perceptual distortion. And distortions, by definition, feel like reality from the inside. In workplaces, this manifests as a particular kind of organizational toxicity that is notoriously difficult to address. A person who responds to every performance criticism by claiming they're being targeted, undermined, or discriminated against, regardless of the evidence, puts HR in an impossible position. The normal corrective mechanisms of accountability require that the person being held accountable accepts at some level the legitimacy of the process. When they instead flip the frame and become the complainant, the system bends toward them. Institutions have structures for handling aggrieved parties. They are less well equipped to handle the aggrieved party being the problem. In intimate relationships, the dynamic is more insidious because it operates through love. The person who cares about the narcissist is precisely the person most motivated to believe that they might be the one who's wrong, that they might be hurting someone they love, that they should examine themselves more carefully. That motivation, which in healthy relationships is a virtue, becomes a lever. The more you love someone, the more effective their victimhood becomes as a tool for shutting down your legitimate grievances. Researchers who study coercive control have documented this as a consistent feature of psychologically abusive relationships. The abuser's distress becomes the organizing principle of the relationship. The partner learns, not through instruction, but through repeated negative reinforcement, that raising a concern produces a crisis. Eventually, they stop raising concerns. The silence that follows is often mistaken, by both parties, for peace. If you are watching this and something in it is mapping onto someone in your life, there are a few things worth understanding clearly. The first is that attempting to prove your case, to provide evidence, to construct a logical argument, to appeal to fairness, will almost never work. Not because the narcissist is stupid, but because the conversation you think you're having is not the conversation that is actually occurring. You are engaged in a factual dispute. They are engaged in a survival response. These are not compatible modes. The second is that the most disorienting feature of this dynamic, the way it makes you doubt your own perception, is not incidental. Researchers studying what Page Sweet calls weaponized gaslighting in abusive relationships have found that the confusion produced is functional. It keeps the target focused on their own credibility, rather than on the other person's behavior. When you spend your energy defending your sanity, you have none left for accountability. The third is that empathy and gullibility are not the same thing. Feeling compassion for someone's distress does not oblige you to accept their account of its cause. A person can be genuinely suffering and genuinely wrong about why. Holding both of those things simultaneously is difficult, but it is necessary. Recognizing the pattern doesn't require you to stop caring about the person. It requires you to stop organizing your behavior around their emotional state at the expense of your own perception of reality. There's a philosophical dimension to all of this that tends to get lost in the clinical language. What narcissistic victim playing represents, at its most fundamental, is a refusal of the shared project of reality. Every functional relationship, romantic, professional, familial, depends on some agreement that external events have a status independent of any one person's feelings about them. That something can be true even if it's uncomfortable. That being wrong about something doesn't mean being destroyed by it. The narcissist's defensive architecture rejects that agreement. It insists that what is real is determined by who is suffering most visibly. And because they are structurally capable of suffering more visibly than you are, not because they feel more, but because they have less capacity to regulate, they win that particular argument by default. This is not simply a psychological quirk. It is a moral and epistemological problem. A culture that consistently rewards performed victimhood and punishes those who name it will find the architecture spreading. It spreads because it works. It works because we're not very good, collectively, at distinguishing between suffering that is caused and suffering that is deployed. The disturbing question, the one that Kohut and Kernberg and Freyd are all circling without quite landing on, is whether the person doing the deploying always knows the difference themselves. The answer, most of the evidence suggests, is not always, not even usually, which means we are dealing with something more complex than manipulation and more tragic than madness. We are dealing with a mind that is built out of some early wound, a fortress so airtight that no truth can enter, and then genuinely believes it is under siege. Understanding that doesn't make it safe to be near, but it does make it, finally, comprehensible. Oh nah.